Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Dysphagia Matters. I'm Julia.
And I'm Yule. Thanks for joining us.
When we think of obstructive sleep apnea, what often comes to our minds is snoring, CPAP machines, or daytime fatigue. But there's also connection to swallowing and dysphagia.
The link between obstructive sleep apnea and dysphagia is something we've wanted to look into for a long time, and we're happy that we're joined to do this today by Dr. Ankit an expert in this field from Northwestern University, where she works as a postdoc.
Enjoy listening.
Hi, Ankita, and welcome to the Dysphagia Matters podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure being here.
Yeah, thank you, and hello. So to start us off, could you briefly explain what obstructive sleep apnea, or short OSA, is?
Absolutely. So I think typically we think of OSA as just snoring, but I think it's much more than that. So it's been defined as it's a sleep-related breathing disorder. And what happens is as we sleep, the neuronal control also just loosens it. And these muscles have to remain, so especially our upper airway, it has to remain open while we are sleeping so that we can continue breathing and restore while we sleep. But what happens in some conditions is like the tonicity of the muscle is lost. And as a result, all the tongue and the pharynx did collapse. That leads to blockage of the airway, and also this can lead to several vibrations of the soft palate, and that's the snoring sound we hear. And this can occur for a number of periods of time. And when this obstruction occurs, that's when the system recognizes that there is a danger. So what happens is there can be moments of hypoxemia or hypocapnia, that is increased carbon dioxide, and then the sympathetic system kicks in, telling the brain there's a danger. And as a result, the brain then tells, okay, come on, wake up. And there's these micro arousals that happen. So this is a cyclical pattern that can occur throughout the night. And this can range from dozens to like hundreds of times during an hour in some individuals. So that's basically what obstructive sleep apnea is. And the American Academy of Sleep Medicine use a metric called apnea-hypopnea index. Apnea is the cessation of breath, and at least it has to be for greater than 10 seconds. And hypopnea is the reduction in the amplitude by at least 30%. So that's how they categorize the severity of sleep apnea. So any events which are greater than 5 would be then classified as mild, and so on, considering the severity.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you for explaining that. And what are the most common causes and risk factors for developing OSA?
I think as I've gathered this information and learn about OSA, I've realized that it is quite multifactorial and quite complex. It's not as direct, and it took me a long to understand how these complex factors are. So typically, it's been classified as anatomical factors, which is straightforward. And we see that, obesity could be one of the reason or risk factor. So that comes to the anatomical factor, where it could just be the narrowing or the crowding of the upper airway. Or some individuals just have the smaller jaw patterns, or it could be they just have large enlarged tonsils, or the back of the tongue could be extremely enlarged, which all these factors easily leads to the narrowing of the airway. These are some factors which are anatomical. And then here comes the fun part about the non-anatomical factors, which is quite complex. And sleep researchers have done a great deal of explaining these. But to put it simply, these non-anatomical factors, the first is the muscle responsiveness. So we know from our background in swallowing in speech pathology that the tensorular palatini and the genioglossus muscles especially would be responsible to keep that upper airway open, especially when we sleep. And here it just collapses quite frequently. So just in few individuals, that muscular responsiveness is not adequate. So that's one. The second is what they call as loop gain. And the way I've understood this, and I'll share this analogy, is think about thermostat. So you have your breathing or your ventilatory response that is going on, and we know the boss is the neural control. The central CPG, your respiratory pattern generators, which is responsible. So here what happens to these individuals is and I'll go back to the thermostat analogy, is like, let's say if a room suddenly becomes hot, the thermostat is going to blow air so that it can maintain that room temperature. And suddenly it becomes cold again, and then it will blow air. So what it does is it's overcorrecting. So likewise, in this few individuals, they're breathing and there is an increase of carbon dioxide. So then there will be an overcorrection. They will stabilize, then it will be a big breath again. And that leads to another increased carbon dioxide. So this is another cyclical loop that happens, and that's why it's called as high loop gain. And the third is again, where they say is like some individuals have high arousal threshold. That means there is a narrowing of airway, but they sense it so quickly that there are these constant micro arousals that happen throughout the night. So they never get good restorative sleep, and there's this deep fragmentation occurring throughout. So these are some non-anatomical factors that could just predispose somebody for OSA. And then additionally, I would also say clinically, now that we have seen a huge population that we see as speech pathologists and is of interest for dysphagia is Parkinson's disease, ALS, or after spinal cord surgery or head and neck cancer, radiation or surgery, a lot of individuals develop OSA. So that comes back to the neuromuscular factors that predispose them to develop OSA.
So in those conditions, it's also a narrowing of the airway due to, for example, Parkinson's or ALS or any other cause, or how can I imagine that?
Absolutely. So what I've understood for Parkinson's, it could be also just the neurodegeneration, which happens again in the brainstem, the dopaminergic pathway, which again leads to the upper airway muscles as well. So here it's more neuromuscular than the tonicity that's happening over here. And likewise in ALS, which has that entire effect. But it could be in, like, say, spinal cord surgeries where there is tissue or the muscles that get ablated, or it could be some peripheral injury that can occur. And these then predispose these individuals for OSA. So a lot of times there's like, they've started a diagnosis with Parkinson's and then later they have developed OSA, or it could be something like that.
Okay, and so it wouldn't be the other way around typically. So it's nothing that occurs at the beginning of the disease onset. So it's more developing in the later disease stages?
That's a wonderful question. And especially what I have understood and read from the evidence is like, especially in Parkinson's. And that's something that I'm actively doing currently. And I see a lot of patients and I'm always in their charts. So I'm currently finding two patterns, that there are certain groups where develop OSA before the Parkinson's. So it could be, again, the hypoxia leading to those nerve damages, or intermittent causing that. And that might also have an effect on those dopaminergic pathways. That could lead to, so I feel like it's more bidirectional, but we just cannot pinpoint and say it's like chicken and egg, what comes first. And that again translates,
Yeah, interesting. And what would you say, how common is OSA? And as far as we've understood it, it's considered an important public health issue. Why do you think it is?
Absolutely. And I agree with your statement that it is an important public health issue. But I think commonly we do not realize that, how important it is. And we also do not realize how common it is. So there was this landmark study which was done in 2019 by Benjafield and colleagues, and they found that around 940 million individuals worldwide have at least mild OSA, which was like, wow, like I did not think about that. And then they further stated that that's nearly, in the United States alone, around 22 million individuals have diagnosed with OSA, and they say there are reports suggesting that a lot of individuals are under-recognized or under-diagnosed. So it could be potentially more than what the numbers we see. And again, I was mentioning about the impact on public health. So OSA is just not a condition, but I feel like it's a systemic condition which has a lot of downstream effects. So a lot of untreated OSA leads to conditions, and because of everything that happens that we discussed earlier, can lead to uncontrolled hypertension, which increases their risk for cardiovascular events or cerebrovascular events such as stroke, or metabolic conditions including diabetes and others, and a lot of cognitive impairments because they're not getting good sleep. So throughout the day, there is daytime sleepiness and all that. And all these then has a huge impact on public health. And the estimated numbers is something around $150 billion annually. So which is huge.
That is a huge number. Yeah.
Absolutely.
What are typically the first signs that make people think, oh, maybe there's something I'm not quite right with my sleep?
Absolutely. I think there is this questionnaire when they go, which is called a stop bang, that typically people can even do by themselves and see if they're at risk factors. But typically they feel like, oh, I sleep for 8 to 9 hours, but even when I wake up, I don't feel refreshed. So that could be that one finding, or it could be their partner saying that, oh, my sleep is disturbed because you kept snoring all throughout. And then there's this gasping and then the waking up. So these are some factors that suggest that they could be at risk for OSA.
Okay, I see. At first glance, OSA and dysphagia seem to be like very distinct or different conditions. What is the connection between the two?
Absolutely. And this was me when I was a clinician back in India. And I was seeing these patients, especially in the ICU, quite fragile, complex, and been diagnosed for maybe some other respiratory failure issues. And I see that they have an OSA diagnosis. And first thing I was like, wait a second, at least in my graduate studies, I have not read anything about the relationship, or at least OSA being a risk factor for dysphagia. But as I delved deeper into this, it was just glaring right there, saying that, okay, the upper airway is a common pathway, both for breathing and swallowing. So that just makes it quite evident that what we see during swallowing is the impairments in the upper airway, the pharynx, or just the neuromuscular impairments, or the UES dysfunctions. And likewise, here in OSA, throughout the night, these micro hypoxemic events that occur, which leads to these further changes, or constant snoring and vibrations leads to these stretching forces, or these oxidative stress and inflammation to the neuromuscular, which could lead to peripheral myopathies, or it could also lead to these neuromuscular impairments. So that's why the commonalities of OSA leading to dysphagia we see among these population.
Okay, so this means that these are the mechanisms that are then contributing to dysphagia in people with OSA?
Yes, at least that is what we think, that these are the common mechanisms that could lead to dysphagia.
And how does dysphagia typically present in this population? Are there specific patterns that are specific to people with OSA?
One important thing to note over here is that at least, so the example I mentioned was somebody who is medically complex, but let's say if you see somebody in an outpatient clinic who wouldn't be that complex. So the typical presentation would not be as you would see for our other swallowing patients, like, oh, I'm coughing or I'm choking on food and liquid. Here, it's more subclinical, and that is why we don't see patients coming to us directly and saying like, oh, I experienced the swallowing problem. So the literature does suggest that the swallowing problem is more subclinical, and it's more sensory than motor, at least initial stages, I would say, and that's why they cannot perceive those subclinical changes. So that's the kind of dysphagia we see in this, and the systematic review that we've done, so the pattern in the literature suggests that they could have airway invasion, or there could be pharyngeal residue, delayed initiation of pharyngeal swallow, which again would explain about those sensory changes. And additionally, there is esophageal clearance impairments that are seen, and there could be tongue control impairments that has been seen, and oral residue. So these are some common physiological impairments that we've seen in this population based on our systematic review and also my dissertation study, where we did a modified barium swallow impairment profile and assessed the swallowing function.
So do I understand it correctly that by subclinical, you mean they don't report any swallowing difficulties themselves, but if you do an instrumental assessment, you would then observe the signs and symptoms you've just described? Is that correct?
That's correct. So I feel like there is a range in this population again. If there is an additional factor, they might have more pronounced swallowing symptoms. But if you see a fluoro study of somebody who has been having OSA, you would not be super concerned, because you don't see like they're directly aspirating or you see immediate residue concerns. And that's why what I've gathered or tried to understand is that OSA acts like a modulator, which starts these changes. And these changes are not profound enough until it's been hit by or compounded by any other biological risk factors.
So OSA alone wouldn't lead to a clinical significant dysphagia, but with other factors together it does.
That has been my clinical observation. And sometimes also there comes another complex over here that this population also reports a lot of reflux, LPR or GERD concerns. And then that could be another factor that overlays and the symptom presentation may change.
That's interesting. It reminds me a bit of presbyphagia, and that on itself it's all right and compensatable, but as soon as something else hits, like a stroke or something else, then the system collapses.
Absolutely. And that's the way I think of it. Is like, again, we know stroke is such a common factor in OSA. So it's like the system is already weak and then you get hit by something and then you start showing things.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So given the suspected prevalence of swallowing difficulties in this population, do you think clinicians should routinely screen patients with OSA for dysphagia? And also now that you've mentioned it's more subclinical, does it make sense? Does it have any value? Or do we have the resources for it?
The way I look at it is like the prevalence study, which was there, which suggests that the systematic review from our team, our group, was like the estimated prevalence is quite wide, range from 20 to 80%. So that again tells us like, what is this number? So that tells that we had so much methodological concerns over here that most of the time people were using non-standardized measures, or the way they were defining was using a patient-reported outcome measures, which again is like I just said before that they had subclinical, but now I'm saying that there are this subgroup of patients who are still reporting. So I feel like it's still more complex and it's what. And based on these studies, at least 20% of individuals self-reported having swallowing difficulties. So I would say like you mentioned about, is it feasible or do we have those resources? And I feel like these people who have sleep apnea are already in the system. So they are either seeing a sleep physician or they're seeing an ENT or a pulmonologist. So it's right there in the system. And we as speech pathologists are part of this system. So it would be so nice that just like our any other conditions where we start referring them just to establish that pathway. Or if nothing, have like a screening tool to see if it would be like, okay, if you have any suspected swallowing symptoms, then we can go further and then have the instrumental evaluation, or have like a large group of population where we select them and do the instrumental evaluation. If we see, it could be like we find out if there are additional risk factors, which prompts us to go ahead and assess them further. I personally think that it's very important because if we don't start screening, our understanding as a field is quite limited. So we'll still be limited in our understanding unless we start doing systematic referral pathways or just clinical pathways and see which population could be more at high risk, or identify these risk factors and include them for screening.
Yeah, definitely. And do I understand you correctly that there's probably no validated screening or assessment tool specifically for dysphagia and people with OSA yet available?
That is correct. At least to my knowledge, that there's nothing that has been directly validated for OSA population, because I feel like our understanding is starting to evolve. We are still in quite an infancy stage. So we could adapt instruments or the screening tools that we already have. And once we have a little more understanding about the kind of pathophysiology in swallowing, it could be nice that we further have more specific screening tools. But we at least need a starting point to go and reach somewhere.
So in the meantime, is there any tool that you would suggest is suitable for clinicians to use, even though it may not be validated for this population, but which is the best available maybe at the moment?
So we had done another study, which was like assessing for predicting factors for people who have sleep apnea. And there was another study by Pizzorni and colleague, and they've also used the EAT-10, that is the Eating Assessment Tool 10. And again, the way it was validated in outpatient clinics. So more people who also had LPR and other concerns. So I still feel that could be a valid tool. It would also be nice to include a reflux symptom index kind of a questionnaire, because having these common symptoms, and then that would be a good screening tool to at least, it might not be foolproof, but it would be a good starting point. Mm-hmm. And then further, we could have more diagnostic accuracies around these.
And would you say that there are particular patient groups with OSA who may be at especially high risk for dysphagia?
Absolutely. And I think I'll circle back to what my initial thing was. I mentioned about the different factors, which in the literature, they call it as phenotypes or endotypes. The way people call it, it could be different. So I think that at least when we are starting to understand it, if we have these endotyping, if we collaborate with sleep physicians, and this might be more research initially rather than direct transfer to clinics, but it would be good to identify these endotypes who could then be at risk. You do these endotyping, find these subgroups, and then probably we could have instrumental assessments. And then it would be nice if we could do longitudinal tracking, because I said that as it develops in future, to see which are these subgroups of OSA who are more prone. And then the second thing I'll circle back would be like, we know that dysphagia is so common in Parkinson's, at least up to 80% of Parkinson's individuals have dysphagia. And then they report that around 40 to 60% of them develop OSA. So it would be, again, a high-risk population that we just see, which is right in our wheelhouse, that we can, I would think that they are at high risk. And again, a lot of head and neck cancer post-radiation or post-chemo and spinal cord injury are stroke survivors. All these would be at the higher risk factors. And also not to forget about frailty and sarcopenia, because it's again that muscular tone that is lost and leads to these neuromuscular impairments. So I feel that it would be nice to consider this gamut as high risk or more vulnerable who needs more longitudinal tracking or screening for their risk for swallowing.
Moving on to the treatment, which treatment approaches currently seem most promising for managing dysphagia in people with OSA?
I would say that the treatment for OSA landscape is just evolving. So it would be hard for me to say one treatment is better than other, because I feel like we're just gathering evidence. But I can share from my experience the things that we've seen would be like my dissertation study was using expiratory muscle strength training in persons with OSA who were already on CPAP. So CPAP is their primary mode. So the way I look at it is like it has to be a bi-prong approach. So you also manage the OSA. Otherwise, they will continue to have all these causes for all these trauma, all these hypoxemias. And then for dysphagia, EMST has shown, and there is a lot of other research where EMST has shown that it had impact on the apnea-hypopnea index, that is the OSA severity. So we tried using that same principle to see if EMST was helpful. So in our small group of 10 individuals, we found that there were only few responders and the others had no effects of EMST. So I would say we still don't know and say that blanket that this could be helpful. But just looking at the pathophysiology, I would say that was an other option for treatment. I don't know anything about the oromyofunctional therapy, but there are literature which suggests that people show benefit with that as well. And I think understanding again from the pathophysiology, the genioglossus and the tongue, I feel like the lingual resistance exercise could also be an avenue, just looking at that pathophysiological aspect. So I feel like we don't know yet to directly pinpoint and say that this is good. And I think I missed earlier mentioning about impaired respiratory swallow coordination, which is again huge in this population. So really finding out what is that main pathophysiological impairment and then tailoring our treatment based on that would be beneficial in my view.
Okay. Oh, that's very interesting. So it would be to tackle the swallowing dysphagia would be strength focused mainly, also with the swallowing breathing coordination, and to break the cycle of hypoxia would be a CPAP, right?
Yeah, so CPAP is considered as a primary gold standard for OSA, but I don't remember the exact percentage, but around 40 to 50% of individuals, they cannot tolerate CPAP. Yeah.
Could you quickly explain what CPAP is?
Absolutely. So CPAP is the continuous positive airway pressure. So it's basically think that you wear a mask or through a nasal canal, which is just blowing air throughout the night. And because of that pressure over here, which helps the airway to be patent and preventing it from collapsing. So that's the balancing work that CPAP does. But think about it. If you have to sleep all throughout night with somebody blowing air on your face, it can be quite uncomfortable. So a lot of folks don't tolerate that. And then there are other approaches such as they use a mandibular advancement device, or there is surgeries, which includes making the airway enlargement, so uvulopalatopharyngoplasty, things like that. Additionally, there is recent advancement where they use a hypoglossal nerve implant. So basically what this implant does is it's stimulating the hypoglossal nerve so that it doesn't collapse and fall, and keeping that airway open. So there's a lot going on. And then, of course, there are other options where recently in the OSA world where GLP-1s have also shown, just with the weight management and everything. So there's a lot happening, I would say.
Yeah, wow. And you've mentioned that not everyone is tolerating CPAP.
Yeah.
I've been staying with a couple who both used CPAP during the night, so both of them. And in the morning when I passed by their door, I heard it, and I'm like, how can you even sleep with this noise? It's so loud. So I can absolutely understand why you actually might not tolerate it, because I don't know if I could sleep with this noise.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, with that big noise blowing all the time. Yeah.
And especially if it's just one of the two people sharing a bed, it might be even more difficult.
Yes. And I was just traveling through an Amtrak, so like a train journey overnight, and somebody was wearing a CPAP. I was like, wow, it's good to read and then experience things, and that's different.
Yeah, and you have to carry it with you wherever you go overnight.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wow. To wrap up this episode, Ankita, what is the key message you would like clinicians and researchers to take away about dysphagia and people with OSA?
I would say that it's also nice that we start recognizing that OSA can act as a modulator to the different conditions that we already see, which has swallowing impairments. And if we identify this modulator, and if we are moving towards more proactive management, why not we start this proactive management in this population? So first, important to have awareness, because a lot of sleep physicians or ENTs or pulmonologists would not put two and two together and recognize that this could be also causing them swallowing impairments. So really having those good partnerships and spreading those awareness and then establishing clinical pathways, just we have done beautiful job for our other population, could be something that we can start doing. And also recognizing that these are the risk factors we notice. So if we can track these individuals longitudinally, and I think as researchers also, we have to do a good job of providing evidence. So starting to have more robust research, because at the moment we have had either mainly cross-sectional, so including some longitudinal studies, or using some other machine learning methods, and using big data to even find out these correlations is something that I would say. So really considering this population as well, as important in our service delivery.
Perfect. Great. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. So thanks a lot for taking the time and joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to be with you both.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. You can connect with us on Instagram, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky, or visit our website, dysphagiamatters.org. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care.